What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speaking their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody looks going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. Tonight, I'm doing a second show on Venezuela because I think the subject matter is so important. I did a show at the end of January with Kevin Zeese, and we talked about how the media in the United States is giving us the exact wrong picture. The Democratic politicians, for the most part, are aligned with the Republican politicians in supporting this coup d'etat that the United States is fomenting. And with Kevin Zeese, we dispelled some of the myths about Maduro being a brutal dictator, about the elections not being free and fair, about the government firing on and brutalizing the protesters. We're not going to go over that same ground today. If you want to find out about that, please watch my earlier show. It was an excellent show. Tonight, I want to talk about how this is part of a larger scheme of the United States to topple socialist governments in Latin America. And with me tonight are two excellent guests, both of whom were in, well, actually, one is still in Venezuela, Lucas Koerner and Ben Norton. How you doing, guys?
Great to be here.
Excellent. Thanks for having us.
Great. So now, Lucas, I'm just going to read his bio. He's a Caracas-based political analyst and editor at Venezuela's only independent, reader-funded English-language news outlet, VenezuelaAnalysis.com. And you all might remember that because that was one of the Facebook pages that was deplatformed last summer. And we'll talk about that. He is also a master's candidate at the Institute for Advanced Studies, IDEA, in Caracas. Now, Ben Norton is a journalist and a filmmaker. He is assistant editor of the investigative journalism website, The Grayzone, thegrayzone.com. And he also is a producer of the video show and podcast, Moderate Rebels, which he co-hosts with Max Blumenthal, who is also a co-founder of the Grayzone project. So again, welcome to the show. Let's get right into it. You and I spoke earlier today about going back to 2004 with the Bush administration, because there's a whole bunch of socialist governments. I mean, we could go back to the 80s with, Nicaragua and some of the other countries. And Bernie Sanders was very active in defending Ortega back then, the Sandinistas. But let's, for now, so we don't take the whole show, start with 2004. And why don't you tell us what the situation was like back then in Latin America and what the Bush administration did?
Beginning in 1992 with Hugo Chavez's civic military uprising against the U.S.-backed oligarchic, two-party dictatorship that ruled Venezuela for since 1958. We saw this. Chavez was elected in 1998, and we saw this beginning of this wave of progressive and leftist movements that were swept to power throughout the continent. And largely with the coordination. First Chavez in 1998, then Lula in Brazil in 2002, coming to power in 2003. Nestor Kirchner in Argentina. Subsequently, Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2005. Fernando Lugo in Paraguay, Correa in 2006, or excuse me, 2007, and subsequently, you saw a regional, bloc being conformed to really contest and push back, centuries of U.S. imperial hegemony in the region, and to construct alternative relations based on South-South collaboration and, basically independent and autonomous development. And the United States, from the very beginning, sought to roll this back. And I think we need to go out to 2004, but to understand this is not just about socialists. These are not socialist governments. I mean, certainly, yes, Venezuela is a socialist government, a self-proclaimed socialist government, and Hugo Chavez did trace a path towards breaking with Venezuela's rentier-dependent capitalism and building a kind of a regional alternative to U.S. global capitalism. But many of these governments, in Brazil and in Argentina, many places, there's just progressive governments that implement very moderate reforms, increasing the minimum wage, and for that reason, they were targeted. To go back to 2004, that this rollback began when the United States, together with France and Canada, invaded Haiti, kidnapped Aristide, and basically sent him out of the country. That was the first coup d'etat, and that marked the beginning. And Aristide was not a radical in any sense. I mean, in terms of his governance, I mean, he doubled the minimum wage and among other important measures, but these were very moderate reforms in the same way that in 1953, the United States overthrew Jacobo Arbenz in Argentina, not because he was a Marxist or a socialist, but because he dared to nationalize some of the unused land belonging to the U.S. transnational United Fruit Corporation.
Let me just interject, because that's where the expression banana republic came from. Because Chiquita bananas was, it was one country that was just totally devoted to Chiquita bananas. And so that's where they came up with Banana Republic. And it was just one of the early projects that the CIA tried to overthrow. And of course, Bernie understands that because he talks all the time about Mossadegh, which happened at the same time because, God forbid, Mossadegh wanted the Iranian oil to be used for the Iranian people and not for British petroleum. So go on.
No, absolutely. And really, you saw with that 1953 coup in Guatemala, like the beginning of this, the establishment of these death squad states that the United States, established and maintained, throughout Central America and, expanding throughout the region to the Southern Cone, where through Operation Condor, the CIA's, Henry Kissinger and the CIA's coordination between the military dictatorships to disappear leftist militants or anyone they thought to be, subversive in these different countries in Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and Argentina and Chile and Brazil. That you saw what we're seeing, and it's important to recognize that Elliot Abrams is a veteran of the death squad states in Central America, who played a key role in delivering arms to the Contra paramilitary death squads in Nicaragua. He was key also in supplying arms to the Rios Montt dictatorship in Guatemala that perpetrated a genocide against the Maya people. Likewise in El Salvador, that's the U.S. trained death squads there. So it's important, right? And he is being brought back from the crypt to preside over the U.S. as point man for the United States policy in Venezuela. So it's important to recognize this long-term imperial continuity and the really bloody hands that are being mobilized here to perpetrate this policy.
And it's also important to note that those are the very countries, the ones that you just mentioned, that we're having so much migration into the United States from, which Trump is using to mobilize his base, fear of the immigrants, but they wouldn't even be emigrating from those countries to our country had we not screwed up their countries in the way that we did. Before we go on to that, do you want to add anything to that, Ben?
Absolutely. Another great example is in 2009, in fact, under Barack Obama and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I'm referring to Honduras. In 2009, the democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya, was overthrown in a military coup that was backed by the United States. Hillary Clinton herself, as Secretary of State, strongly supported that coup and then legitimized the subsequent right-wing puppet regime. Still today, Honduras has a right-wing puppet regime. It's essentially a dictatorship led by President Juan Orlando Hernandez, they call Ho, and there's a popular song, Que Fuera Ho, to get out the president. And what's interesting about that particular coup is it led to, it's horrific, but it led to the worst homicide rate in the entire world. In 2012, 3 years after the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras, Honduras had the highest rate of violence in the world in a country that is not at civil war. And that is directly related to the U.S.-backed military coup against Manuel Zelaya, who was not even a socialist. As Lucas was mentioning, many of these leaders were basically kind of progressive nationalists. Mm-hmm. They believed in pursuing an independent foreign policy to benefit their people. Manuel Zelaya didn't even run as a leftist necessarily. He moved more to the left over time, and that's why he had to be ousted. And, as he traced, we go back all the way to the 1950s and see again and again and again these series of military coups, of soft coups like we saw in Brazil. This is another very important case. Right now, Brazil is governed by a fascist, and I'm not being hyperbolic. Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, strongly supports the military dictatorship. He has restored a kind of commemoration ceremony, annual commemoration of the military dictatorship, which was also backed by the United States. He has said many horrific things. I mean, I won't even go into some of them, like threatening parliamentarians with rape, making many racist comments and homophobic comments. But even most egregious of all is that the president of Bolsonaro, who's backed by the U.S., closely allied with the U.S., who just visited the CIA on his first trip to the United States, Bolsonaro has in the past said that the biggest problem with the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet was that he didn't kill enough people. And Bolsonaro thinks that the problem with the Brazilian dictatorship is that it tortured instead of killed, is in his language. Those are quotes from him. But anyway, the point is that the only reason Bolsonaro is in power now is because his current justice minister, a former judge named Sergio Moro, oversaw the political imprisonment of the former leftist president, Lula da Silva. Lula da Silva would have easily won the presidential election, but he was in this political so-called anti-corruption crackdown led by the right-wing judge Sergio Moro. Lula was imprisoned, and also the previous leftist president who came after Lula, who was also democratically elected and quite popular in the country, Dilma Rousseff, she was ousted in a kind of soft coup, a parliamentary coup, over allegations of corruption by the judge, who was then rewarded by Bolsonaro with the promotion to become justice minister. And Sergio Moro, this judge who led the so-called anti-corruption crackdown, just visited CIA headquarters in Virginia with Bolsonaro. So anyway, there's so many cases we can talk about, but Honduras and Brazil are really two important cases because they show how these coups work. One is a military coup in which the military literally ousts the president, and then another is a kind of soft parliamentary coup. And in both of those cases, these are coups that were backed by the United States that installed right-wing pro-U.S. governments that have continued to wage war not just against the left throughout the region, but against their own domestic populations. And we have to see this as a continuation of a policy that goes back to the 1950s, and of course one that is being exercised exactly the same way in Venezuela right now.
So with Brazil, I just want to go back to that. Now, Lula was very beloved. And then Dilma Rousseff, I guess she wasn't as, she didn't have as much authority or support, or she was undermined. I'm kind of trying to figure out, because, you know, what I said to you guys earlier is that we tend to glorify the left, you know, and we overlook the flaws of some of these leaders. Was there corruption in Brazil? There was actual corruption, or was it overplayed?
Well, I'll let Lucas jump in as well, but really quickly, I'll say that there were actual studies of this done, and there was actual scientific polls done of the different parties looking at corruption. And of course, there was corruption in the Workers' Party. There's corruption in every party, but the Workers' Party was less corrupt than numerous other parties that were not targeted in the car wash operation, which was this operation that was used to oust the Workers' Party leaders. So yes, of course there's corruption, but the point is that every party has corruption. This is the same thing with the so-called anti-Semitism scandal in the Labour Party. It's like, okay, maybe there are a few isolated examples of actual anti-Semitism. Every party will have an example of this, but it's being so grossly exaggerated and put out of proportion in a way that is completely inappropriate to use that as a political weapon against Jeremy Corbyn, and the same way corruption was used as a political weapon by right-wing judges who were visiting the CIA today in Brazil. So yes, to answer your question in short, yes, there was corruption, but compared to the party, the PSL party right now of Bolsonaro, it's actually more corrupt according to studies. So the issue is not corruption, because they installed more corrupt leaders. And Michel Temer, who was the right-wing interim president, unelected, who was just a complete neoliberal who was installed after Rousseff and before Bolsonaro. He was one of the most cartoonishly corrupt leaders of all, who had something like a 5% approval rating and was so corrupt that he was unable to run an election for president because he was found in violation of past electoral law. They don't care about corruption. It was simply a ploy used to push out the leftist government.
With regard to Brazil, I think I agree with everything that Ben has said. I would say that it's important to recognize in the case of both Lula and Dilma that neither have been convicted of any corruption. That Dilma was ousted for what was effectively an accounting error of equivalent to raising the debt ceiling that Obama did. There was no actual evidence of corruption against her. And likewise, in the case of Lula, he was effectively indicted and convicted for unspecified offenses, quote unquote. And Sergio Mora, this judge himself, has institutional links to the U.S. State Department. He was being advised by the U.S. State Department, as part of this broader anti-corruption initiative. And that's all very well documented. I encourage folks to go to Brazil Wire for more on that, which is definitely one of the greatest sources on that. But I would say, to answer your question, that it's important to recognize that the issue of corruption in, all of these progressive and leftist parties, they opted to take the electoral road to power, attempting to seize the state, enter the space of the state and dispute it, and an attempt to transform it, and to make these societies incredibly unequal, dependent, U.S. Imperial dominant societies more equal, more egalitarian. And in doing so and entering the state and playing parliamentary politics, which is an inherently dirty game. And, these states are bourgeois states, they're capitalist states, and, they're completely embedded in this global ensemble of, imperial power relations, and that in which corruption, is, the modus operandi of governing in many of these. In Venezuela, the mode in which the Venezuelan state works is that, as a petro-state, is that those who come into the state effectively are able to get their hands on the petrodollars and distribute it as patriots. That's how the state functions. Now, Chavez had attempted to transform it, and certainly many inroads were made in doing so. But the fundamental logic, as Chavez recognized at the very end in one of his final speeches, were made unchanged. And I think the same way, in Brazil, the Workers' Party was not able to fundamentally transform the state. And unfortunately, both, to a large degree, the PT and the Workers' Party got captured by within this state in this way. And, this, had very serious consequences. I think that in the case of Venezuela, sorry, I lost my train of thought because in the case of Venezuela, the workers, the Socialist Party, definitely there's a debate of whether this could have been avoided, whether the issue of entrapment within the state, whether it could actually have been transformed, or whether this responds to structural impediments that, within the logic of the way the state is set up and its insertion into the, this global system, basically they did the best they could under the circumstances, and given the lack of support from the U.S. left, from the global Northwest, there really wasn't a lot of alternatives, and things ended up the way they are. And I think it's an open debate of whether they could have done more or not, but we are where we are.
Well, I think it's interesting, you mentioned before about doing the electoral politics route. I'm wondering if that's even possible, because I look at Cuba, where they actually had a revolution, and they have the Communist Party, and they have control of the whole government. And I was there in 2014, and I actually felt they had more democracy with a one-party government than we have here in the United States, because you could run for election on a municipal level, on a provincial level, and on a national level. And everybody could run, and everybody could input their ideas, and they didn't have corporations, buying these elections and controlling the politicians. And they were able to get ideas from the ground up, like the whole idea of semi-privatizing, letting certain people rent out rooms in their homes, or have restaurants in their homes, or drive their cars as taxis. That all came out of one province. And Raul Castro understood that because of the trade embargo, they needed to shake things up, because it was just impossible for the government to control everything. But I remember reading, and I'm going to date myself now because this goes back to college in the late 70s. I took a class called Revolutions in the Modern World. and I studied the Cuban Revolution. And I remember reading Tad Schultz. And he was a reporter. He was a great reporter for the New York Times that happened to be around at the time of the Allende coup, at the time of there was a Venezuelan coup in 1958. And also he reported on the Bay of Pigs before it even happened. So I remember reading in one of his books that he said the communist or the socialist revolution, they believed that they couldn't have, like people were saying, well, why do you only have one party? Why don't you have free elections? Why don't you have civil liberties? Why don't you have a free press? Why don't you have all these things? And he was basically saying, because we need to have equality for the people first. We need to have free healthcare. We need to have free education. We need to have everybody having a good standard of life. Because what happens is when you interject all this sort of civil liberties and freedom, then you get people trying to topple your regime. So it's kind of like a fine balance. I'm all about the free press, of course, but I understand his point of view, because let's talk about Venezuela right now, where they have a mixed economy. They have private media there, and these private media have been trying to thwart Chavismo from the beginning. So can you speak to that private media? And Ben was telling me, Lucas, that you can talk about the families. They're sort of run by these families, and that's kind of like how it is in Latin America.
I mean, Venezuela is not a socialist country. I mean, that's the biggest, I would say, misunderstanding or misrepresentation of Venezuela. It's, over 70% of Venezuela's economy is privately owned. In fact, that proportion has only increased, as a result of the oil boom that occurred under Chavismo. That, what you do have is you have a leftist, government, or a self-proclaimed socialist government that has attempted to transform the, the nature of the state and, move the economy in a socialist direction, a transition towards, away from capitalism. So, but that has not gone very far at all. And you look at the, composition of, Venezuelan political economy, that as you talk about the private media, the most watched television stations are all private, anti-government, and in many cases, rabidly anti-government networks. For example, the most watched is Venevisión, which is owned by Gustavo Cisneros, who's one of Venezuela's most important billionaires, and one of Venezuela's richest men. And Venevisión actually played a very crucial role in the April 11th, 2002 coup that was supported by the United States at the time, by the Bush administration, in which Elliot Abrams reportedly gave the green light at the time. And they were broadcasting these images that falsely showed that Chavistas were shooting at opposition demonstrators, when in fact there were opposition or snipers that were shooting both opposition demonstrators and Chavistas. So of course, the point is, if you go to any newspaper kiosk, you're going to find that the vast majority of the newspapers are privately owned and anti-government. The same way, with social media, tends to be largely anti-government, and there's been studies to show that the influencers within Venezuela social media are largely opposition, and there's definitely a very strong anti-government bias there as well, and the opposition has used that frequently as a campaigning tool. So I mean, it's it's as in many countries in Latin America, the opposition, the media, the private media has played the role of as an opposition party in many ways, and it's attempting to push back against these governments' attempts to implement, as Ben says, very moderate reforms, increasing the minimum wage, guaranteeing better labor protections, et cetera, that, and the minimum of what Bernie Sanders' program is in the United States, that the United States and the local elites have resisted these, transformations, tooth and nail with coup d'etats, as Ben has described. And, in terms of the consolidation, these societies are very, very extremely hierarchical, unequal societies in which you have these, oligarchic families that, for example, in Venezuela, the largest food company is called Polar, and that is the property of the Mendoza family. They have basically a monopoly on food production, in which, the vast majority, and they don't actually produce the food, they just import. They use state dollars to import the raw materials, which they process to produce corn flour, to produce beer, margarine. All of the major products that are consumed, in the food sector largely come from this company, and they have all of these different subsidiaries and sub companies within different sections of the economy, which they're able to effectively extort the state large amounts of petrodollars. So the key to understanding the story of Venezuela over the past 20 years is not only this attempt to transform state and society to democratize it in an unprecedented way, because remember that all of these governments have been the most democratic governments that these Latin American countries have ever had. I mean, we talk about Barack Obama as the first black president of the United States. But in Bolivia, you have the first indigenous president who actually, achieved massive transformations for indigenous people. In Brazil, you had the first president from a worker, a former union leader. Likewise, in Venezuela, a former, a poor, Afro-Venezuelan man, from the interior of the country, and then a bus driver. These were profound transformations. And, these oligarchic elites have sought to combat them. And in Venezuela, the most successful way they did that was through, basically gaming the system and able to extort state dollars, saying that they were going to import things when they didn't import them. And as a result, billions and billions of dollars. I can give you one statistic and I'll stop. That in 2012, the number one recipients, the top recipients of dollars from the state for imports were all private entities, including transnational corporations like Pepsi Cola, which is a part owner of Polar. So, I mean, it's really important to recognize that, the opposition talks about corruption and denounces that and accuses the government, but it is these elites that are aligned with the opposition that have sought to overthrow the government that have been the principal, beneficiaries of the corruption, the historic entrenched corruption of the Venezuelan petrostate.
Now, you're talking about some of these American companies, they play into the, the problem with the power grid. So one of you, I can't remember which one this morning, referenced the article by the two Rodrigos in the New York Times, which I just read. And they were basically saying that, yes, these problems were prevalent during Maduro, and he bears a lot of blame for the decrepit power system. But the U.S. sanctions have made it worse. So even if there were problems, he can't fix them now. Which one of you would like to detail that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that there's two key factors that Francisco Rodriguez, for those who don't know, he is no Chavista, he's no leftist. He is, the chief economist at Torino Capital, a Wall Street investment bank. He is the former economic advisor to former Venezuelan presidential candidate last year, Henry Falcon. He is a very stalwart critic of the Venezuelan government, and actually supported the U.S. coup, the one led by self-proclaimed interim president Juan Guaido. But he's been very explicit. He's very honest in recognizing, unlike all of the mainstream media and most opposition figures, in Venezuela, and recognizing the impact of U.S. sanctions. And with regard to the electrical grid, there's two facts. The first one is that, the impact of the U.S. financial sanctions that were implemented by the Trump administration in August of 2017, which, like I said, has basically been completely ignored by the corporate media. And, this prohibited U.S. banks, U.S. financial institutions from lending or engaging any kind of new debt dealings with the Venezuelan state and with its state oil company, PDVSA. And, according to Rodriguez, this had a key impact on the Venezuelan state's ability to continue its contracts with both General Electric and Siemens, which were the two companies which are involved in maintaining Venezuela's electrical grid. So this has meant that, over the past year and a half, Venezuela's electrical grid has faced, very severe issues with under maintenance. And absolutely, again, the government has a lot of responsibility for the underinvestment and, many of the projects that were not completed by Odebrecht and other companies due to corruption. But this has played a key role. The other huge impact was as the New York Times itself reported, buried at the very end of its article on the March 7th blackout, 3 weeks ago, that the backup thermoelectric generators, which run on diesel power, which could have come into action to back up the Guri Dam, which is the source of 70% of Venezuela's hydroelectric power, of Venezuela's electric power as a whole. These generators were unable to come into effect due to a lack of diesel, because on January 28th, the Trump administration imposed a de facto oil embargo on the country, prohibiting the sale of diesel to Venezuela, which is, U.S. is the #1 source of diesel. So this means, in hospitals, and, right now, a lot of, I was just at a hospital today, as a result, tomorrow, they only have enough diesel to run till 12 p.m. tomorrow, and this is directly a result of U.S. sanctions. So this is really having an impact, and it's a question of how long this go. I mean, this is a very callous, calculated policy on the part of the United States to to inflict maximum suffering on the Venezuelan people to oust the government. And as William Brownsfield, who was Bush's former ambassador to Caracas, to Venezuela, he said that that perhaps the best strategy will be to quote unquote accelerate the collapse, even if this leads to greater suffering of Venezuelans in the for months or for years. So this is a very explicit policy on the part of Washington.
Yeah, that was an explicit policy on a lot of Bernie supporters, too. They were saying that maybe it'd be better if Trump gets in and the whole United States goes to shit, and then maybe we'll finally get the kind of government we want. I remember people talking about that, but that's not working out so well under Trump. Let's talk about this quote-unquote humanitarian crisis, because you're there now, Lucas, in Caracas, and you were there, Ben, reporting with Max Blumenthal. And Alfred Desaias, who is the former UN rapporteur who went down there at the end of 2017 to see whether there was a humanitarian crisis going on, he came back and said in front of that UN panel that Max and the other woman from the Grayzone spoke in front of, we are swimming in an ocean of lies. I love that, because he said that there's no humanitarian crisis in the wealthy neighborhoods. Why didn't you tell what you saw when you were there, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to stress that it's not just that there's no humanitarian crisis in the wealthy neighborhoods. I didn't see a humanitarian crisis in working class and poor neighborhoods either, thanks to initiatives run by the government and also run by volunteer Chavistas, community groups, community organizations, and communes that are working together to feed and support their communities. And of course, this is all invisibilized in the US corporate media. But first I'll say, Alfred Desaias was the first UN special rapporteur, so human rights expert, who visited Venezuela in 2 decades. They just ignored Venezuela. And then, of course, when he went, he was told I was supposed to expect a humanitarian crisis. And he went and he was like, actually, there are economic problems, but this is a pretty normal country. So there are a few things to say in response to this. One, before I even talk about Venezuela, I think we should keep everything, when we say everything about Venezuela, we need to keep context in mind. In Yemen right now, Yemen is suffering from the worst humanitarian catastrophe on planet Earth. The United Nations has reported this for 2 years now. In fact, yesterday, March 26th, 2019, was the 4th anniversary of a US-backed Saudi bombing campaign that has devastated Yemen, turning the poorest country in the Middle East into the worst catastrophe on planet Earth with no parallel. Meanwhile, while the US is destroying and pulverizing Yemen, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, starving millions, we keep hearing that the US has to intervene to stop a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. So that alone, just that stark parallel, should raise questions, serious questions about the actual interests of the US government. But even beyond that, that's just important context. As for Venezuela itself, because we should talk about the situation, there are economic issues. There was very bad runaway inflation that has been relatively under control now. There are some products, mostly imported products, that are very expensive and unaffordable for average Venezuelans. But there still is food everywhere you go, not just in rich neighborhoods. In rich neighborhoods, you can find Domino's Pizza, Wendy's, Burger King, McDonald's, TGI Fridays. You can get sushi. I mean, it looks like Miami in the rich parts of Caracas, like in the east and other parts of Venezuela. But even in working class neighborhoods, the government has created a program which you'll never hear about on CNN called CLAP. The CLAP program are food boxes and bags that are given out to communities, to at least 6 million families, according to government figures, and they're expanding it. In fact, I've seen different estimates ranging from 70 to 90% of Venezuelans are getting food from the government and through the CLAP program. And this food is basically free. It costs a few pennies. And in it, you get kilos of rice, corn flour, oil, lentils, pasta, and sometimes evaporated milk. And this is what the government is doing to make sure Venezuelans aren't starving. Many of these products are produced by the government. The others are produced by Venezuelan companies that work with the government. And as I mentioned, at least 70% of the country is benefiting from these programs, including opposition supporters. It's not just the supporters of the government. It's also opposition supporters. I physically went to different working class barrios to interview people and to report for a film that I'm making. And I interviewed opposition supporters who were getting the clap boxes. And these clap food boxes, by the way it's distributed is to local communities, and the food comes from the government, but volunteers in the communities are the ones who, for no pay, they work together with their neighbors to distribute this food to people. In addition to that, the CLAP program was, by the way, every month, every 30 days, and now the government has increased it to every 2 weeks, every 15 days, so twice a month. In addition to that, the government has regular subsidized markets where food and other materials like soap and toothpaste are sold below market value. Because one of the problems, as we've discussed, is that Venezuela still has a mixed economy where about 3/4 of the economy is in private capitalist hands. And in the past, still today, there has been a lot of hoarding and speculation. So in the past, at different times, you'll see things like toothpaste was prohibitively expensive. So then the government cracked down and put price controls on certain products like toothpaste. And then the corporate media here in the West says, and the US and Europe says, oh, well, Maduro's a dictator because he's clamping down on the rights of the free market and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, the point is that there are these subsidized markets where you can buy these goods. So there's a lot to talk about. Lucas can add more because, you know, he's been actually living there. I was just there for a month. But the point is that no, there's not a humanitarian crisis. There are economic issues, but compared not just to Yemen, but compared to neighboring countries like Colombia, compared to Brazil, compared to Haiti, these countries that have been ravaged by neoliberal right-wing governments and by the US government, compared to those countries, Venezuela is actually comparatively doing quite well, despite the major economic war that has been waged on it for years.
Now, yeah, they were able to easily stop that coup in 2002 because Chavez had the support of so many people. And based on your and Max's interviewing of the people, it seems like Maduro has the support of the people right now. But the question is, if this economic warfare goes on, you know, they've prevented Citco, which is the wholly owned U.S. subsidiary, from sending the money from the gas that they sell in the United States back to the country. They're preventing, London is preventing them from getting access to $1 billion of their own gold. There doesn't seem to be any international solidarity of the working class anymore. It seems like everybody's kind of fighting their own battles in their own countries. And back in the 30s, you know, there was so much solidarity, people going to Spain about Franco and all that stuff. The UN seems to be pretty impotent. You know, when you were talking to the UN, when Max was talking to the UN, they were talking about Article 96 to refer what is going on over there to be investigated as a war crime. But how far is that going to go, really? How long do you think the people can hold out? Do you think the army is in danger of defecting? Because if the army goes over to the opposition, then Maduro is through. Like, there doesn't seem to be any anti-war movement in this country anymore. I was at the Hands Off Venezuela protest in Los Angeles last week. There may have been 200 people there. You know, this doesn't seem to be in the consciousness of the American public, even as much as Iraq was, you know, the Iraq war. And our candidates aren't really talking about it. I mean, Bernie Sanders made like a 3-part tweet. He ended up in a good place, basically saying the U.S. should not be engaging in wars of regime change. But the first 2 parts of the tweet kind of repeated the myths about the election not being free and fair and the government attacking, you know, perpetrating violence against the protesters. Tulsi's talking about it. Ro Khanna is talking about it. But nobody of the candidates or any of the American politicians, even like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, AOC. Nobody's talking about ending the sanctions.
Bernie Sanders has, gone out on a limb with, with Jeremy Corbyn and Varoufakis and, outlining this new progressive international or whatever that's supposed to mean. But a progressive international that doesn't have a firm, anti-imperialist position, not just opposing, military intervention, which, by the way, Bernie has not taken an explicit position opposing. I mean, he has opposed military intervention, but he hasn't really gone out firmly against that. But more importantly, opposing sanctions and fundamentally disputing Washington's imperial prerogative to blackmail other countries and basically declare them non-democracies, no matter how many elections they've won, no matter how rigorous the electoral process is, and effectively overthrow their governments. Bernie Sanders took a very courageous position in the 2016 primary that very famous debate that was very important, in which he challenged Hillary Clinton for having Henry Kissinger as her advisor. Where is his similar stance against Elliott Abrams today, given his own, as you mentioned, important activism against the U.S. dirty wars in Central America? So I think that the opposition to U.S. sanctions, to U.S. imperial prerogatives to blackmail and overthrow countries that they don't like, that the imperial godfather dislikes, needs to be disputed on a fundamental level without making any concessions. But more deeply, to answer your question about what's happening on the ground, I don't think that at this moment, this coup, it's important to recognize, continues to be a failure from the perspective of Washington, given that they had anticipated, that there was going to be a military rebellion or some kind of fissure within the armed forces within 24 hours, and this thing was going to be concluded, but that did not occur. There was no popular rebellion in support of Guaido. All of what they were anticipating, has, not come to fruition, and as a result, we're as of Wednesday, we're 8 weeks, we're 2 months into this, coup that was supposed to be wrapped up ages ago. And, Trump is the only direction he has to continue to double down, inviting the white to the White House and, further, threatening Russia and, to actually intervene militarily and continue to impose absolutely criminal, crushing sanctions, which, important to recognize that the UN Special Rapporteur for the negative impact of sanctions, Idris Jaziri, has denounced, this is illegal as a mechanism of government and is killing thousands, if not tens of thousands of Venezuelans. Now, it's important to recognize that Venezuelans are not passive victims of this, blockade and strangulation. That even in the midst of these blackouts that we've had, over the past 2 days and earlier in the month, people remain very calm and there's been no in Caracas. There's been no widespread rioting. There actually been important certainly yes, there's isolated instances of people taking advantage of the situation, but people are showing solidarity with one another and trying to come together because the Venezuelan people, not only Chavistas, but opposition supporters as well, the vast majority of working people who, are majority of black and brown, it's important to note, do not want civil war. And that is a reality. And the opposition is trying to push the country towards that. And, just Juan Guaido said on Tuesday that there will not be, there will not be electricity, will not be restored. There will be not be solutions to water. There won't be water or gas in people's houses while Maduro remains in power. We must take all necessary steps to accelerate the collapse of this government, and this is explicitly what their discourse is and what they're playing at. And they do not have majority support for this, even if there is a large section of Venezuela's population. I would even dare say a majority of Venezuela's population, due to its management of the economic crisis, and it would be even willing to support an opposition candidate in a presidential election. Nonetheless, that does not translate to a support for the opposition's violent regime change program that has been crafted in Washington and is being sought to promote a dirty war to eliminate Chavismo as a political force, which is an aim which I don't think that they're going to be able to succeed at, because this is a political movement that's not just about a government, it's not just about a president, but it's really deeply rooted in the barrios, in the countryside, in these efforts to transform society from below to create a more democratic society. As Ben mentioned, people organizing their communities, trying to make them better places, even, with opposition support, independent of partisan political identification. So, that's what this project is about. And I don't think that it's going to be defeated by the United States.
Yeah, I'm glad he mentioned a lot of these points. And something that I've been thinking about through this conversation that's so important is the historical context of Nicaragua, because if you look at the regime change playbook that the United States has, there are different levels and steps, right? So in some cases, they just go straight for a military coup. That did not work in Venezuela. They were trying to do that. The U.S. and right-wing opposition politicians inside Venezuela, along with Colombia and Brazil, have been trying to encourage a military coup. There are reports, in fact, that the U.S. and Colombia were bribing and offering to pay defectors from the Venezuelan military to come to Colombia, although there are now reports that the Venezuelan military defectors in Colombia have been completely abandoned by the far-right Colombian government, which is pretty predictable considering how far-right the government is. But anyway, the point is that that didn't work. Venezuela has a massive military that is largely a base for nationalism and Chavismo that does not want to collaborate with the empire, right? To undermine the Patria Grande, to undermine their own, homeland. So that strategy didn't work. So after the military coup failed, and it failed spectacularly on February 23rd, which was also the day of this fake aid concert organized by a billionaire in which they've raised very little money of fake aid money, and we don't even know what's going to happen with the little money they earned anyway. But aside from all of that, they moved to the continuation of an economic war, which is exactly what happened in Nicaragua. And even though Nicaragua is a small country and the situation is different, we can learn a lot. In the 1980s, the U.S. began a terror war. It actually began under Carter, not under Reagan, but it was expanded substantially under Ronald Reagan. And in this war, famously, of course, the CIA armed and trained the Contras, who were far-right death squads that were massacring civilians and anyone mildly on the left, and also just people who weren't supportive of the regime, not even just leftists. And in this war of terror, the Sandinistas were still able to hold on. The terror war was not necessarily what brought down Nicaragua, even though the Sandinistas are still in power today. Of course, it should be important to recognize. But what happened was that the U.S. continued this economic war to squeeze and strangle the Nicaraguan population, the entire economy, and the people collectively, to such a point that in 1990, they had an election that the U.S. thought the Sandinistas were still going to win. But actually, the opposition, the Chamorro oligarch family, the right wing, won that election because Nicaraguans were tired. They knew that the terror war would continue. They knew that the U.S. economic war would continue until the right-wing opposition came into power. And then they were elected into power, and then they were right. The U.S. terror war and economic war stopped. So it's important to look back at that history because these are the same tactics that the U.S. is not only applying to Venezuela now, they're also applying these tactics, of course, to Nicaragua. They just passed the Nica Act after the failed coup attempt last year in Nicaragua, but specifically to Iran. Iran definitely does not have a socialist government. They have a nationalistic anti-imperialist government, but for the U.S., anything other than complete acquiescence is not tolerable. And even though, Iran does have a right-wing social government socially and culturally, they actually do have a lot of state ownership still. They have a lot of social programs. They have not implemented the Washington Consensus. And the U.S. has been trying to destroy any of these social programs that exist in Iran through a similar economic war, through crippling sanctions that were temporarily lifted by Obama. But of course, the Trump administration has illegally reimposed those sanctions. And Mike Pompeo himself, the Secretary of State and former CIA director, we must keep in mind, who's orchestrating a lot of these plans with John Bolton, an architect of the Iraq War, Pompeo himself admitted that in Iran, just like in Venezuela, the strategy is to strangle and to specifically to starve the people, which is the language he used, until they overthrow their government. Yeah. So Venezuela is not necessarily a unique, isolated case. These are the same tactics of siege warfare, to use the language of Alfred de Zayas, the former UN Special Rapporteur, who wrote a report, and he said that sanctions are simply the contemporary form of medieval siege warfare to cripple countries and to bring entire nations to their knees.
Well, you know that the Iraq sanctions were responsible for the death of 500,000 children. And when Madeleine Albright was asked about that on CNN, on 60 Minutes, if she thought it was worth it, she actually said yes. So that shows what kind of psychopaths they have, running our foreign policy.
Not only, I think, is Nicaragua very prescient with regard to the U.S. regime change strategy, but I think that it's also important to remember, in the context of this, Democratic primary that we're on the cusp of, that there was a bipartisan support for the ousting of the U.S. Regime change against the Sandinistas. That there was a fundamentally bipartisan agreement that the Sandinistas had to be eliminated. They had to be taken out of power. There was only a strategic difference of how to do it. Whereas the Republicans wanted to support, the Reagan administration was supporting a terrorist war with these paramilitary death squads who were bombing neighborhood clinics and burning large farms, etc. The Democrats prefer to just do it with an economic embargo to strangle the country and then oust them through elections. And ultimately, as Chomsky documents, they all came together in unison to celebrate the victory of Chamorro in the 1990 election. And similarly, today there is very solid, I would say, Democrats and Republicans are marching in lockstep in support of the U.S. coup, as statements by Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and others, recognizing Juan Guaidó as the interim president of the country. So there definitely, unfortunately, is this bipartisan support that needs to be resisted, and this needs to be a centerpiece of the 2016 primary to resist that.
Well, we're just running out of time to talk about Venezuela, and I do want to keep you on, Ben, to talk about Yemen and to talk about Gaza, because there's new developments there. But I want to thank Lucas and let him go to continue his great work. And I've been putting up your website, venezuelanalysis.com, which is such a fantastic place to get information about what's going on there, because God knows we can't get it in our U.S. media. Before I let you go, tell me what made a Philadelphia born and raised boy grow up and move to Venezuela, and now you're studying there and reporting there. What brought you there?
I think that, for many people in, growing up in the 2000s, in America was a very exciting place, to be, as a young person, given the rise of these progressive and leftist governments, really, not only, transforming their societies, making their societies more democratic, more egalitarian, but, Chavez really furled the banner of socialism once again, following the defeat of the 20th century socialism and all of the tragedy that entailed. And this was very important and very inspiring. And I've always in many ways sympathized with the Chavista project. And I believe that the U.S. left has much to learn from Chavismo, on multiple levels that we really need to study and take very seriously. The Venezuelan Chavista experiment and all that it implies. And for that reason, I came here and I remain here and continue to learn from it and hoping that we can transmit those lessons.
Great. Well, we look forward to reading more of your articles, and perhaps if this thing continues, hopefully it'll get resolved soon and the people will win. But if it continues and I decide to do another show on it, we'll check back with you. So I'm going to let you go, and thank you very much.